Hello everyone, and welcome back to the History of Scotland, episode 30, Scotland and the Crusades. Now, last time we told the full story of the First Crusade, from start to finish, from the walls of Constantinople to the city of Jerusalem. We learnt about the trials and punishment the Crusaders endured during their journey, how they fought back the Turks, Muslims and their very own compatriots. Now today we are going to end our three-part series discussing Scotland's participation in the Crusades as a whole, learning what role the nation of our beloved Scotland played during these calls for war in the Holy Land, as well as their relationship with the Knights Templar. Although there were Scottish Crusaders involved in every war, their influence and numbers were not notable, largely because of their concern that the English kings would siphon off Scottish taxes for the Crusades for their own purposes, and because they were often at war with the English later on. Despite this, nobility like Lagman, King of Man and the Western Isles, and Robert de Quincy led enthusiastic Scottish followers into the fray. Other leaders like Patrick, the Earl of Dunbar, the Earls of Carrick and Atholl, the Valois, Bruces, Mowbrays, Alexander de Sutton, Adam de Gordon and others played their part. Even our future King David I was so keen to lead a Scottish army to liberate the Holy Land that he had discussed this with his nobles and the Pope. But instead of this, he made sure the Knights Templar, the protectors of the pilgrims, were granted land and properties in Scotland. One of the main references I'm going to be using this episode is a paper called The Influence of the Crusades and Contemporary Religious Life in Scotland from the University of Glasgow. So for any future reading you wish to make after this episode, head to the University of Glasgow website and The Influence of Crusades and Contemporary Religious Life in Scotland. It's a really good paper. It's rather old, but the information in there is very valuable to this episode, and I'm sure you'll learn a lot more by reading that paper. So, anyway, let's dive one last time into the Crusades and learn about Scotland's influence and participation in these holy wars. The call of Pope Urban II for the deliverance of the Holy Land met with a ready response. The enthusiasm which it aroused must have exceeded the expectations of even the most dedicated Christian. Describing the effect of the Crusades in the English Isles, a chronicler states, "Its thunders echoed through England and the other islands of the ocean, nor were they drowned by the roar of the waves which their deep channels separate these islands from the rest of the world." There is every evidence of the widespread interest which the summons to the Crusade evoked. "The fame of what had then taken place," Roger of Wendover says, "spreading through the world, stimulated not only the Mediterranean provinces to this pilgrimage, but all those who in the remote islands or the barbarous nations had heard the name of Christ." After the terrible ending of the People's Crusade, which we told in our first episode of this series, the First Crusade began to actually gain momentum. In due course, the better equipped and more orderly bands of crusaders under leaders of renown set out and came together at Constantinople. Henry of Huntingdon had some justification for saying, "It was the Lord's doing, wonder unknown to preceding ages and reserved for our days, that such different nations, so many noble warriors should leave their splendid possessions, their wives, their children, and that all one accord should in contempt of death direct their steps to regions almost unknown." With every allowance for exaggeration, we can hardly doubt the widespread interest in the First Crusade. The names of different countries the enterprises are given even by English chroniclers. Roger of Hoveden mentions Italy, Germany, France, England. Henry of Huntingdon's list is fuller and speaks of crusaders from England, Normandy, Brittany, Aquitaine, Provence, France, Flanders, Denmark, Saxon, Germany, Italy, Greece and other countries. There is, however, no definite mention of Scotland either. The Chronicles of Scotland and England, Henry of Huntingdon raises a question as to what is meant by such references to Scotland. He suggests that those described as Scots who shared the Crusade in 1096 appear to have been from Ireland. His suggestion is quite a pertinent one, The name Scotia, originally given to Ireland, had not been for any great time applied to Scotland, and there is a natural hesitation as to which country is meant when the name Scotia is given at this time. However, there would not seem to be any question about what is meant by Scotia. The lists which have been quoted, and particularly in the list of Akenherd, takes care not only to mention Scotia but Hibernia. Anderson's suggestion would hardly seem to have real justification, because in addition to this there is no other evidence that the Scots were actually engaged in this campaign. Another chronicler, who was a priest at the time of the Council of Clermont, went with Stephen of Blois on crusade. In 1097 he became Baldwin's chaplain. He was not present at the siege of Antioch or at the siege of Jerusalem, being then at Edessa with Baldwin, whom he accompanied later to Jerusalem. In his Historia he gives the account of the expedition. He speaks of the confusion of the tongues by the Crusading army through so many different nations being brought together. He gives as different nations present: Francia, Thraciae, Galliae, Almonae, Angalae, Scotae, Italiae, Libraeae, Graeciae, Armenae. Whatever doubt there may be as to those who he describes as Scotii, there can hardly be the same uncertainty in a similar reference by Gubert de Hogant. Gubert was probably at Clermont. He became a monk in 1064 and was elected abbot of Notre Dame in 1104. His piece was written around 1112 and was a historical work that he did himself. Although not himself a crusader, he speaks intimately of the expedition. He refers to the uncouth tongues among the crusaders, as well as to the outlandish accoutrements which they were provided, and he singles out the Scots for a special mention. He lets us see what he means by Scotai. When later the same work he refers to King William the Elder, who subdued the kingdoms of the English, the Scots. We do know William the Conqueror certainly advanced into Scotland and made the King of Scotland at the time acknowledge himself as his man, as we referred to in the past episode. The conquest of Ireland may have been a dream of William the Conqueror, but it was certainly never more than a dream, and he did not set foot in that country, much less than conquer it. It seems quite clear then that what Gilbert mentions the Scots as being present he means by Scotii, the inhabitants of Scotland. The Scotochronicon quotes Sigurd, actually acknowledging this quotation is from that chronicler. There would hardly seem to be any doubt that Scotland was represented. Those who took part in the First Crusade, the times were such as would be likely to encourage many to go on crusade. The opening of the First Crusade found Scotland with the rivalry of jealous factions. Under such conditions, it may be urged that the Scots had enough to do at home without venturing on any foreign enterprise. A feature, however, of the rivalries of these unsettled years was marked antipathy towards those who had come from England after the Norman conquest and had settled down within the north. What could be more natural than those from the southern kingdom who had come to make their home in Scotland and were now far from welcome there? No encouragement to settle again in England should embark on a wider enterprise and take the cross with its opportunities of adventure instead, in hopes of advancement in worldly things, as well as its spiritual call and prospects lives of their souls. A certain man, Robert, son of the famous Godwin, was found in Scotland at this time. The experience of this in England under the reign of William Rufus drove him back upon Scotland again for refuge. Encouraged thereto by Edgar, although there was in that country a marked unfriendliness towards such refugees. Ultimately, he took leave of Edgar and set out for Jerusalem in that great expedition of Godfrey of Boulogne, which he also, with his other Scots, left very much evidence of his valour. The words in that great expedition, as the words with his other Scots, are not round in every version of the Scotochronicon. At least this affords a suggestion instance of the conditions prevailing. The unsettled conditions in Scotland, so far from demanding the presence of many of these warriors, would actually set free from home interest for such ventures as the Crusades afforded. Now remember, a lot of these foreigners that came from England, such as the Saxons and the Normans, were not welcomed properly in Scotland. We saw that with Duncan II, and King David I will struggle with this as well. Edgar the Etheling was probably an outlier, but still, the court that was known as the English court in Scotland was not popular, so any of these foreigners would certainly have lived in Scotland, but maybe would have then taken up the cross and left due to the hostilities they had been presented by the natural-born Scottish. We know that the good old Uncle Edgar was with the Crusaders in the early years of the expedition. The statistical account of Scotland describes an Eric stone in the east end of the church at Glenbrave, which in its inscription provides information, among other things, that Osbert Alphont was in Syria with Godfrey of Bouillon, and that he perished in battle. Scotland did contribute men to the First Crusade, and we have evidence enough to lead us to conclude the Scots were those heard Urban's call and set out with enthusiasm for the deliverance of the Holy Land. Now, I want us to explore the relationship Scotland had with one particular holy order of Christendom, the Knights Templar. Now, I'll be jumping massively ahead in the future for this telling, so if you wish to leave the future of Scotland's history a mystery, then please jump ahead to the end of the episode where we round everything off. This will avoid any spoilers about our future monarchs of Scotland. To truly cover the legend of the Knights Templar origin, we need to go back to nearly 3,000 years. King David was the second king of Israel. He was a warrior king who had united the two kingdoms of Judea and Israel and defeated the Palestinians. King David had assembled the materials needed for the construction of an amazing temple, but as a punishment from God, due to the blood he had spilled, he was forbidden to build it himself. The temple, regardless, was to be built on the mountain, the sacred ground where God had commanded Abraham to kill his son Isaac, before relenting at the last moment. King David was succeeded by his son Solomon, who completed his father's plan, and over the course of nearly 8 years, from 964 to 956 BC, he oversaw the construction of the temple. Upon its completion, the temple sat unused for 13 years, whilst the rest of the citadel and royal palace were completed, but in 934 BC, the Ark of the Covenant was placed inside, and a great celebration called the Feast of the Tanabries was held. In 597 BC, the king of Babylon conquered Israel. After 10 years of dealing with a rebellion from the conquered people, he decided to destroy Jerusalem and the temple of King Solomon. He stole all the artifacts, except for the Ark of the Covenant, which to this date has never been found, and they took them to Babylon, along with a large number of captives. Around 50 years later, Cyrus the Persian vanquished the king of Babylon and eventually freed the Israelites and allowed them to return to Jerusalem, where in 516 BC he constructed a second temple on the site of King Solomon's temple. This second temple stood until 20 BC, when Herod the Great dismantled the second temple and constructed a magnificent temple in an attempt to glorify Jerusalem and his name. This temple was destroyed by the Roman Emperor Titus in 70 AD. The site of the temple later became the third holiest place in the Islamic faith, when the Prophet Muhammad ascended to the heaven by climbing a ladder of the light raising from a sacred stone that has become part of King Solomon's temple. In 691 AD, Caliph Abdul-Malik started to build the Mosque of Zakaria, or the Dome of the Rock, next to the site of the temple, which was completed by his son. It was destroyed and rebuilt a number of times until the final mosque was completed in 1099 AD. The Order of the Temple was founded in 1118 AD at Jerusalem, which had been liberated from the Saracens during the First Crusade. The successes of the Crusaders had brought pilgrims to the Holy Land from all over Christendom, but the difficulties these pilgrims faced were numerous. There was a lack of roads and means of transport. The routes were menaced by raiders and bandits. There was a major risk of being cheated by the innkeepers and merchants they encountered. It was to afford some protection to these otherwise unguarded pilgrims that Hugh de Paynes and 7 other knights founded the order. The King of Jerusalem, Baldwin II, granted them quarters near the royal palace at the captured mosque. The knights came to be known as the Knights Templar, or Knights of the Temple, for the next 10 years in additional to... Also, along with their regular duties, they excavated the ruins of Solomon's temple under their quarters. In 1867 AD, a team from the Royal Engineers led by Lieutenant Charles Warren and financed by the Palestinian Exploration Fund discovered a series of tunnels beneath Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, some of which were directly underneath the headquarters of the Knights Templar. Various small artifacts were found which indicated that the Templars had used some of the tunnels, though it is unclear who exactly first dug them. Some of the ruins which were undiscovered came from centuries earlier. The leader of the Templars engaged on a tour of several European countries between 1124 and 1128 AD. He received official endorsements from the Catholic Church at the Council of Troyes in France in 1124, and he visited his comrade Henry St. Clair, first Earl of Roslin, at the St. Clair home in Roslin, Scotland, around 1126 to 28 AD. During the visit, he was given land by King David I of Scotland, the first Templar perpetuary outside the Holy Land, near Edinburgh, now called Temple. Around this time, the leader also established a perpetuary in London, England. The leader of the Knights Templar visited Scotland to establish the first connection of Roslin to the Knights Templar. As for the excavation under Temple Mount, no evidence is recorded, but it would appear that the Templars found something. In 1139 AD, just 21 years after the order's founding, Pope Innocent II issued a papal bull which exempted the order from obedience to local laws. This ruling meant that the Templars could pass freely through all borders, were not required to pay any taxes, and were exempt from all authority except that of the Pope himself. With its clear mission and ample resources, the order grew rapidly. Templars were often the advance force in key battles of the Crusades, as the heavily armoured knights on their war horses would set out to charge at the enemy in an attempt to break opposition lines. Although its members were sworn to individual poverty, the order was given control of wealth beyond direct donations. A nobleman away to the Crusades might place all of his assets under the order's management while he was away, accumulating wealth in this manner throughout Christendom. In 1150, the order began generating letters of credit for pilgrims journeying to the Holy Land. Pilgrims deposited their valuables with a local perpetuary before leaving, received a document indicating the value of their deposit, then used that document upon arrival in the Holy Land to retrieve their funds. This innovative arrangement was an early form of banking and may have been the first formal system to support the use of cheques. It improved the safety of pilgrims by making them less attractive targets for thieves, and also contributed to the order's coffers. Based on the mix of donations and business dealing, the order established financial networks across the whole of Christendom. They acquired large tracts of land both in Europe, Scotland and the Middle East. They bought and managed farms and vineyards. They built churches and castles in Scotland. They were involved in manufacturing and importing and exporting from Scotland. They had their very own fleet of ships, and they owned the entire island of Cyprus for a year in 1191. The story of the Kingdom of Jerusalem is a sorry tale of discord, and the glorious cause which brought the Crusaders to the east was often forgotten in dynastic struggles and political intrigues. Under these circumstances, it is remarkable that the eventual Saracen success was delayed so long, yet it was not until 1291 AD that the last stronghold of the order, the city of Arc, fell. The remnants of the order retired to Cyprus, and the purpose for which the order had been formed had now vanished. A few years later, in the famous episode, the King of France, Philip, was in dire need of money, having taken too many war loans. King Philip was known as Philip the Fair, but he was anything but. In 1305, he orchestrated the installation of his own handy-picked man as the newly elected Pope Clement V. Now Philip the Fair needed money, and he approached the order, but was refused. Next, he tried to get to the order to accept him as Grand Master on the pretext he would lead a new crusade to the Holy Land. But the knights did not choose to give up their freedom. King Philip then, with the reluctant but essential connivance of the Pope Clement V, determined to gain wealth of the order for his own use. In 1307 AD, he suddenly arrested all Templars in France, and he persuaded every country but Scotland and Portugal to follow suit. The wealth and independence, pride and secrecy of the order proved to deprive them of all influential friends, and the French king was able to secure their conviction for heretical practices. However, Philip never managed to gain the wealth of the order, as someone had tipped the knights off, and the day of the mass arrest the Templar fleet set sail, managed to escape to Scotland. In France, many knights of the order were tortured to gain confessions, and a great deal of scandalous legend was added to the story of the order by this means. Many resisted the power of the rack and were burned at the stake as heretics. The Grand Maester was the last to be put to death in Paris, 1314 AD. These are his moving words from the scaffold. "It is only right that at so solemn a moment, when my life has so little to run on, I should reveal the deception which has been practised and speak up the truth. Hear me! Before heaven and earth, all of you for my witnesses, I confess that I am indeed guilty of the greatest infamy, but the infamy is that I have lied. I have lied in admitting the disgusting charges laid against my order. I declare, and I must declare, that the order is innocent. Its purity and saintliness has never been defiled. In truth, I have testified otherwise, but I did so from the fear of terrible tortures. Other knights who retracted their confessions had been led to the stake, I know. Yet the thought of dying is not so awful that I would not uphold my confession to foul crimes which were never committed. Life is offered me, but at the price of perfidy. At such a price life is not worth having. If life is to be bought only by piling lie upon lie, I do not grieve that I must lose it. Modern historians reject the trial of the Knights Templars as thoroughly unjust and acquit the order of the charges brought against it. The Catholic Church have long held that the order was innocent of any wrongdoing and recently recovered the document of the Synod parchment which reveals that Pope Clement V had pardoned the leader of the Knights Templar in 1314 just before his death. The surviving members of the order merged into other orders or went into hiding. In Portugal, King Denis refused the Pope's command and instead renamed the Order of the Christ. This order was to continue in history into the 20th century and directly influenced European exploration and expansion for over 400 years. Legends arose that some knights fled to Scotland, where an excommunicated Robert the Bruce was engaged in a battle against the English, and it seems logical and likely that Bruce would have welcomed the knights, powerful trained warriors that they were. These knights fought for the Scots at Bannockburn in 1314 and in return were granted sanctuary, land and titles by a grateful king. There is also a theory that the sailors of the order managed to use their skills to navigate across the Atlantic where they found America. In 1312 AD, the Order of the Knights Templar was dissolved by the Council of, and their remaining property was transferred to the Knights of St. John, the Hospitalitors. In the 1440s, 130 years after the dissolution of the Knights Templar, Sir William St. Clair, Jarl of Orkney, was the most powerful man in Scotland. He was a direct descendant of William de St. Clair, the last Templar Great Master of Scotland, who had died taking the heart of Robert de Bruce as part of James Douglas, Lord of Douglas's expedition on a last crusade to Jerusalem. Sir William wanted to build a temple on his land at Roslin near Edinburgh. He sought and received a founding charter from the church in Rome to build a collegiate chapel in 1446. His most likely reasons for wanting this temple were to be establish a seat of spiritual authority to rival King James II, and to house artefacts brought by the Knights Templar to Scotland in 1126, and perhaps after the order's dissolution, and inherited by the St. Clair family. The temple was designed and constructed like King Herod's temple in Jerusalem. The layout of Herod's temple was unknown to archaeologists until the mid-19th century, nearly 400 years after the construction of the chapel. St. William St. Clair brought in masons. At this time the word mason meant builder and included stone, wood and metal masons from across Scotland to his chapel. To house them, he built the town of Roslin near his castle, and the site of the chapel, then on the 20th of September 1456, construction started on the chapel. The Roslin Chapel contains the oldest document showing a modern first-degree ceremony being conducted by a Knight Templar. On the lower frame of the window in the southwest corner of the chapel there is a carving, carved between 1440 and 1450, of the first degree. There are many Templar symbols and images of Templars carved throughout the chapel. When King James II died in 1460, his son James III came to the throne, and he thought Sir William was posing a great threat to the crown of Scotland, so he stripped the Sir William of Orkney in 1470. Sir William resigned as Earl of Caithness in favour of his son in 1476, and he died in 1484 AD. The St. Clair family was also heavily involved in the creation of the Freemasonry at Kilwinning on the other side of Scotland. I hope to cover the history of the Freemasonry in the future of Scotland's history, but for now I'll leave it there. In 1483, 27 years after the construction of the Roslin Chapel, the first Freemason documents are found which state the borough of Aberdeen is recorded as being involved in settlement of a dispute between 6 Masons of Lurch. Masonry is starting to spread out as lodges initiate candidates and give them the Mason word. It would appear that the Masons who constructed Roslin Chapel found something of great value in the ceremonies and teachings they learnt at Roslin, and when they returned home they took this ritual and sense of brotherhood with them, and over the next 100 years the Mason Lodge took hold in Scotland. But as I said, I will leave this for a future tale as we go throughout Scotland's history, and when we reach the 16th century, I'll be sure to make a 2-part episode explaining the Masonry situation in Scotland and the history of the Freemasons and their lodge in Scotland. So everyone, that's it for this week. Hope you enjoyed the finale of our 3-part series. This episode was really hard to research for, and it was also really hard to record. A lot of tongue twisters, but also I feel like I'm still down with the flu a little bit, so the episode was really hard to record. A lot of starting and stopping, so I hope the episode was okay. I apologise for the crammed in information, but I wanted you to get the full understanding of the role Scotland played in the Crusades. Even if that was meant us jumping a tiny bit ahead in history, I know there were some spoilers for future events, but to truly make sure we cover all the facts, I really had to. I really enjoyed telling the story of the Crusades as a whole though, from the failed People's Crusade to the First Crusade that actually succeeded in its objective. We will return back and forth from the Holy Land as we continue our tale, so don't worry, I'll keep you all updated of the larger European Catholic conquests throughout history. Anyhow, next week we return to our main story, which will have us return to our Scottish tale and the reign of Alexander I of Scotland. A reign lacking a lot of evidence and information to go on, so that means we can only really spend one episode on him. But after that, we finally start one of my favourite monarchs, as you can probably tell, and one of Scotland's most famous kings, David I, who will have 4 episodes dedicated to him, maybe 5, so look forward to that coming soon. Thank you again everyone to the continued support on this series. If you have the time, please do follow our Twitter at the History of SC1 and head to our Facebook group called The History of Scotland. You can search on both social media platforms The History of Scotland podcast, and I'm sure you'll find us easily there. If you wish to discuss the episodes with myself, head to Facebook, that's probably the best place to discuss it, but Twitter can also be used. As always, any further corrections or issues with this podcast, please let me know at the History of Scotland podcast at gmail.com. That is History of Scotland podcast at gmail.com. A big shout out to all the recent reviews I've received on Spotify. We have reached 103 reviews with a 4.9 average rating. It's insane that everyone is enjoying this series. I honestly don't consider myself a really knowledgeable historian, even that great of a speaker. So seeing you guys enjoying this series as much as I am recording it, it really does mean a lot and helps me push for further episodes. Give me that confidence to carry on and not to give up. Anyway, please leave a review if you can as well, and our podcast is on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts and many other great podcasting sites. Next podcast will be next week as normal, so until then, stay safe, have a great week guys, peace, and for one last time, Deus Vult.